On a frozen morning in 1945, a solitary figure lay motionless as 50 enemy combatants perished around him without a single rifle shot being fired. They fell under a rain of fire that tracked their every movement across the Alsatian snow. German officers were certain an observer was lurking nearby, watching their every step. Yet, despite passing within 4 paces of a narrow trench, they saw nothing. In that shallow depression lay a man barely weighing 120 pounds, clutching a communication wire. He didn't breathe with the frantic lungs of a soldier. He inhaled with the rhythmic patience of a woodland predator. A hunter's stillness is the ultimate weapon on a chaotic battlefield. How did a humble Kentucky farmhand use the secrets of bird hunting to become the most lethal eyes of the Allied front? To grasp the magnitude of Garlin M. Connor's feat, we must look at the desperate stakes of January 1945. The European theater was reaching its breaking point. Allied forces had pushed to the German border, standing on the threshold of the Rhine. But a stubborn obstacle remained: the Colmar Pocket. This German stronghold threatened the entire flank of the liberating armies. If it wasn't cleared, the advance would stall in a bloodbath. The German response was a massive counterstrike. 600 infantrymen backed by legendary Tiger tanks and armored destroyers. Facing them was the 3rd Battalion, a group of bone-tired Americans who hadn't seen a warm bed in months. The odds were suicidal, and the weather was an enemy of its own. At 10 degrees below zero, the cold didn't just bite. It shattered equipment and claimed lives through sheer exposure. For most, this was an alien hell. But for one man, the sub-zero woods felt like home. Garlin Connor, standing only 5 feet 5 inches, looked more like a weary laborer than a war hero. Born in 1919 in the isolation of rural Kentucky, his childhood was defined by the Great Depression. Hunger was his teacher. He learned to handle a rifle before he could master a textbook. His primary quarry? The wild turkey, a creature with such sharp vision that the slightest twitch of a finger triggers flight. His father taught him, still hunting, the art of becoming an inanimate object. You don't just hide. You vanish into the geography through absolute silence and breath control. Beyond stealth, he learned navigation. In the dense Kentucky brush, he'd mark his path with subtle signs, broken twigs and scored bark, to ensure a safe return. These weren't just rural hobbies. They were survival blueprints. By 1941, Connor volunteered for the infantry. Over 28 months of relentless combat across North Africa and Italy, he survived 7 wounds and 10 major campaigns. The military provided the uniform, but the Kentucky wilderness provided the soul of a survivor. On that pivotal January morning, Connor was actually recovering in a rear-line hospital. Hearing the thunder of the German assault, he knew his brothers were being overrun. He didn't wait for orders. He slipped out of the ward, commandeered a vehicle, and drove toward the smoke. He arrived just as a call went out for a volunteer for a suicide mission. Someone had to establish an observation post in the no man's land between lines. Connor stepped forward, grabbing a Thompson gun and a heavy spool of communication wire. As he sprinted nearly 400 yards through a barrage of steel, he unspooled that wire behind him. It wasn't just a phone line, it was his hunting trail. Just as he marked trees in the forest, that wire was his umbilical cord back to reality amidst the blinding smoke of war. He crawled 30 yards past his own front line into a ditch only 12 inches deep. "I'm in place," he whispered into the handset, ready for targets. The German wave approached, hundreds of men and massive steel tanks. Connor lay like a stone. He spoke coordinates with the calm of a man counting livestock. Artillery shells began to pulverize the German formations. The enemy scrambled to find the source. Patrols searched the area, firing blindly. At one point, German boots were so close they kicked snow into his trench. Why didn't they see him? because he was utilizing the turkey hunter's secret: zero movement, hooded eyes, and rhythmic breathing. He had become a ghost in the snow, but the threat was closing in. Soon, the Germans were so near that the American batteries couldn't fire without risk of killing their own man. In the third hour of the siege, with enemies just 15 feet away, Connor made a chilling choice. "Blanket my position," he commanded. The radio operator froze. Connor was calling for a lethal strike directly on his own head. Sacrifice is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The order was given. The sky turned to fire as dozens of heavy shells rained down on Connor's exact coordinates. The ground buckled. Shrapnel turned the air into a shredding machine. In his 12-inch deep furrow, Connor pressed his face into the frozen mud and waited to die. When the smoke cleared, the German attack had vanished, replaced by a graveyard of steel and fallen men. A crackle came over the radio. "This is Connor. I'm still here. They're retreating." He had survived the impossible. He had directed a hurricane onto himself and walked out of the eye of the storm. But the war didn't end there. Days later, he was leading charges in urban ruins, capturing dozens of prisoners, and earning more decorations. By the time he headed home, he was arguably the most decorated soldier in the nation, second only to Audie Murphy. Yet, when he returned to the hills of Kentucky, the medals went into a sack at the bottom of a trunk. He married Pauline, raised tobacco, and served his community for decades. He never spoke of the ditch. He never mentioned the fire. At night, however, the war returned in his dreams. He would sit on his porch in the dark, smoking in silence, carrying a weight that 1940s medicine didn't have a name for. Garlin Connor passed away in 1998, a quiet farmer whose neighbors had no idea he had once saved a battalion. His story might have ended there if not for Pauline. For over 20 years, she fought the bureaucracy of the Pentagon to ensure his bravery was recognized. Finally, in 2018, 7 decades after the battle, she held his posthumous Medal of Honor. The legacy of the turkey hunter was finally etched into history. Hundreds of families exist today because one small man refused to move in a shallow ditch. He proved that the skills learned in poverty and nature could overcome the mightiest war machines. If you believe the quiet courage of Garlin Connor should never be forgotten, please hit the like button for Winds of Thought. It ensures these legacies reach the next generation. Join our community for more untold chronicles of valor. Where in the world are you joining us from today? Tell us in the comments. Garlin once said his father taught him to be fearless. To him, that didn't mean he wasn't afraid. It meant he did his duty regardless of the terror. He used a phone line as a trail, a ditch as a fortress, and his own life as a shield. He was a hunter, a survivor, and above all, a brother to the men he saved.